So once upon a time, there was this father with the cutest 7-year-old girl that you've ever seen. The dad wanted to give her a gift, and so he went to the store and came back, and this little girl unwrapped this gift of a bow and arrow. It's the kind of toy bow and arrow though, with the suction cup on the front. And so the dad went to the garage, grabbed a few scrap pieces of wood and a can of spray paint, and made her a little target on the wood. After showing her how to use it for a while, he then went into the house. And it wasn't 5 minutes later that the girl came back in and said, Daddy, I know how to hit the target every single time. A little skeptical, the dad goes, How did you do that? And she said, Well, it's easy. First, you shoot the arrow, and then you paint the target. See, the dad was not quite so happy because this target happened to also hit his car, and the target was painted with that spray can. Now, while it's humorous to think about this little girl missing the mark, the idea of our morality isn't something that is a movable target. People are really good at deciding for their own selves, this is good, this is bad. And the problem is that doesn't always line up with God's standard. Because of that, we fall short of what God would have for us. God was gracious enough to give us different examples of how we come to him when we mess up and when we fail. One of those examples here is in Psalm 51, where God teaches us to confess sin for restoration. In that confession of sin, so that we can be restored, there's two aspects that David highlights here. The first is the idea of recognition of our sin, and the second is the idea of requesting God for forgiveness. But before I get too far into this passage, let me give you some of the context. David had just sinned by taking Bathsheba and committing adultery with her. He then tried to hide his sin, doing everything he could, bringing Uriah back to try to say that it was his kid, and then eventually just saying, send him to the front lines and leaving him to be killed by other people. David, having thought that he got away with it, decided everything was fine. But God knew. God sent the prophet Nathan and said, you are the man who did this. And he owned up to it. And in stark contrast here, he then finally says, you're right, I sinned. And so he writes this psalm. And while we don't have time to talk about every single verse, verses 1 and 2 really do highlight the themes throughout this psalm of how the confession brings restoration. He first says in verse 1 and 2, have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. So we see here him first acknowledging his sin. And he goes exhaustively. He uses 3 different Hebrew words to describe all the ways in which he sinned. I think it's underappreciated in the Psalms why it gets repeated, these same ideas. We can just kind of see it as repetition for the sake of making a point. But I think David here is using different words to describe different concepts. So it's worth talking about what these words mean. The first one, he asks for God to blot out his transgressions. Transgressions, or pesha in Hebrew, is the idea of broken trust, the idea of having an agreement with somebody and then not keeping your end of the bargain. Kind of like making a handshake deal with somebody and then not keeping your end of the bargain. You transgressed against that person. For David, he's the king of Israel. He has responsibility from God that he's supposed to go out into war to fight battles. He's supposed to reign honorably and with integrity. And instead, he took what God had given him and used it for his own purpose. The second way David acknowledges his sin is this word iniquity, a very religious word that doesn't get used in many other contexts. But here the idea in Hebrew is something that is bent, something that is not straight, not in line with what God would have them. It's used in a different psalm to talk about a guy's back, an old man's back who is bent over, because that back is supposed to be straight and upright. And David here, he's crooked. That's the expression that we use, right? We'd say that somebody is crooked. His heart is not right. Having a crooked heart is like trying to build a building with a bent yardstick. The house is going to be a little bit lopsided and eventually fall. So David owns up to the fact that his heart is not in line with God. And the third way is this word sin, the most generic way. In Hebrew, chata. You got to kind of spit when you say chata. And it's the most common way we describe sin, missing the mark. It's what Paul talks about in Romans over and over again. And it's similar to that first opening illustration of the arrow, when you shoot a target and you don't hit what you're aiming for. And for God, he has a standard that we don't live up to. It'd be like trying to shoot an arrow and hit the moon. We'd never be able to perfectly do it. And David owns up to that. He missed the mark, obviously. But he didn't just miss the mark. He also missed the mark because his heart was in the wrong place. And his heart was in the wrong place while breaking what God had given him. And in contrast to before Nathan confronted him, he now owns up to the totality of it. And I think the application for us is similar. How can we be in right relationship with somebody if we don't acknowledge our problems and our sin? How can you have a friendship with somebody if they don't own up to how they hurt you? So before we can move on to requesting forgiveness, we have to acknowledge our sin or recognize our sin. After this, we get into the idea of what are we going to request from God? Because David uses 5 different times where he requests something from God. The first one we can see in verse 7. We'll only get into 2 of them for the sake of time today. Verse 7, he says, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." So when he requests of God, he requests for 2 different things. One is for forgiveness. Hyssop is something used in the ritual practices of the priesthood in Israel, and it represented symbolic cleanness. Or in other words, David got stains all over himself, and he needs to be wiped clean from that. One of my least favorite chores is laundry. Laundry just feels like a pile that eternally builds up and never gets finished. Even when you wash the clothes, you're still wearing the clothes that are going to be dirty for the next load. I remember getting a shirt, ministry shirt, at the same time as somebody else. And a year later, that person's shirt was still bright, clean, new looking. Well, my shirt had been dingy. What happened? Well, I just like throwing all my clothes in one load, colors and whites together in cold laundry. And the other person actually washed theirs properly. Likewise, David is saying he needs to be washed whiter than snow. He doesn't want to be just forgiven for a few things. In order to be right with God, he has to be perfectly forgiven in order for God to be just and David to have a relationship again. And that's the kind of God that we have, one who would forgive us completely, not holding against us our faults. The other thing that he asks of God is the idea of a renewed heart. He says in verse 10, "Create in me a clean heart and renew a steadfast spirit within me." If all that God did was forgive David, David would be no better off because his heart would still be bent. It would still do the same things that God would have to forgive over and over again. But God is so gracious. He doesn't just forgive David. He says, here's the new heart so that you can do different actions. And likewise with us, we need like a heart transplant because our desires are not always in line with God. It'd be like if I took Taylor here and I said, we're going to do a 3-legged race, except I'm going this way and he's going that way. Well, humorous to imagine us sprawling all over the floor. If our desires aren't in the right line to go the same place, we're not going to get there. And similarly with God, if our desires are not in line with his, we're not going to be in right relationship with him. So again, we recognize our sin and we request from God. And this is what restores us back into relationship with him. This restoration is because we have a loving and heavenly Father. Or let me paint it to you like this way. Say a friend offends you. What would it take for you to forgive somebody else? It's an important question that different people have different answers to because we've all had somebody offend us. Somebody could say, well, I feel bad for doing that, but did they actually feel sorry, or did they just not like the consequences of their action? In contrast, what if somebody first came up to you and said, hey, I'm sorry that I did this. And they said specifically what they were sorry for. And then they said, I was wrong to do that. Because they didn't just say they felt bad, but they recognized what they did was morally wrong. And then they followed that up with, how can I make it right? Knowing that it wasn't just something that they did, but that they broke something of yours, either trust or an object or whatever. And then they said, here are the action steps I'm planning on doing so that I don't do that again. And then finally, if it wasn't enough, all the actions that are dependent on them, they said, can you forgive me? Like, I know action needs to follow that kind of apology, but if this was a first offense, I couldn't find it myself to not forgive them. And likewise, if we could forgive somebody for apologizing that way, how much more our Father in heaven? How much more would he who loves us want to make us back into relationship with again to forgive us? What's more, even when we fail to apologize and own up for all the ways that we fall short, God is still loving and he still wants to take us out of the mess that we've created and to forgive us. We recognize our sin, we apologize for it, and that brings us back into relationship. That same little girl who used the spray pan on the car, well, the dad wasn't very happy about that, but he then said, hey, that's not the point. This was wrong. Here's why. The daughter then said, and they understood, she understood what she did was wrong and then apologized. And so the dad then got to teach her the loving lesson of how to take off the spray paint off the car. But then they cleaned up the mess together. And that's just like our Heavenly Father. When we acknowledge our sin, he brings us back into relationship with him and works through the mess together.